Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is Malcolm Gladwell, who is the author of 8 best-selling books, including his latest, Revenge of the Tipping Point. He is also the co-founder of Pushkin Industries, an audio content company that produces his podcast, Revisionist History, among others. Gladwell is a remarkable storyteller who looks for the hidden patterns that help explain modern society. Hi, Malcolm.
Hi.
How did you find or create your niche, that voice as a cultural, interpreter, guru, storyteller? How did you figure that out?
Well, it's nice of you to say that I figured it out. I think it just comes out of being started out as a newspaper writer, and, you get moved around at newspapers. So I was a business reporter, then I was a science reporter, and then I was the New York correspondent. So you get, the whole ethic of a newspaper is you can write on anything given the opportunity. And so I got very comfortable writing about a variety of subjects. And then I went to the New Yorker and did the same thing. There was you weren't assigned to a particular beat if you were a staff writer like I was. You could just wander around. And so I've been wandering around ever since.
You love explaining things. You say you were born to explain things.
I like explaining things.
A special gift of yours.
Yeah. I do. I get a certain amount of pleasure in being in having the most kind of economical explanation or engaging explanation for. There's always moments when I'm writing something when I try something which I feel like, we're getting super nerdy. I doubt my audience will let anyone else take them down this particular path, but I'm going to try.
How much distance do you find you need, or do you need a lot of distance before you can sort of judge and say, here's a pattern or here's a cause and effect and how I put it together? I mean, you talk about COVID and the opioid crisis were both things you covered in Revenge at the Tipping Point.
You mean how much distance does one need from the actual event? Yeah.
Do you need any to sort of start to be able to...
You need some. I mean, and if you don't, the hardest part in writing about a current phenomenon, is knowing whether it's over. So, in my first book, The Tipping Point, I write about New York City crime, and the kind of error I made was in thinking the story was over. And in fact, the story had just begun. So I wrote about, New York has 2 great crime declines. It's the second decline that's the interesting one. I wrote my book about the first decline, thinking that was what the story was. The story is the second decline. So it was like, I almost wrote that crime chapter in that book should really have been written 15 years later, because that's when, by 2017 or 18, we start to understand what actually happened in New York. So in that case, what I'm saying is the decline that begins in the mid-90s does not become legible, we think, for another 20 years. So, in that case, you need a lot of distance. And if you're not sure that what the phenomenon's over, I think you need to be very clear to the reader that you're describing something that is ongoing. And you need to communicate a degree of uncertainty about what your conclusions are. I'm not always sure I did that early on in my career.
But you don't mind admitting mistakes or incomplete analysis?
No, I think it's all part of I think that's all part of what it means to be someone who writes about ideas, is you have to be willing to go back and look at what you've done and say, oh, I got this wrong, I got this right. Lots of professions do that. It's only, people have difficulty with those kinds of admissions of error in politics and journalism. But other professions, they do it all the time. Academics.
Yeah, I learned this. Something changed.
Something changed.
I've got a new set of facts. But you're right. Politicians are not allowed. You said this. Now you're saying this. So
not allowed. And writers are not allowed. Thinkers are not. But other people constantly. Sports fans change their mind every 5 minutes, and it's totally fine. they're like, you'll scream at some pitcher, you're a bum, and then the pitcher strikes out the side in the ninth, and he's a hero, and you have no one has any problem with that, right? That is as it should be, But yeah, I don't know. I've never understood why there should be a separate set of rules for writers and politicians.
Now, you're known to hold strong opinions too. You say you love to poke the bear. You love to you take shots. There are things that seem to get you, like elitism, or things that are a little too prestigious. Harvard being one, or people that sort of put themselves above.
Yeah, well, that's the Canadian in me. I like a little. I feel like there's a gentle leveling impulse if you're Canadian, which I like to kind of play with a little bit. I do think there is the thing about American society that I dislike the most is I find it intensely hierarchical, and at the same time unwilling to own up to its hierarchical nature. And it's that kind of contradiction that bothers me.
Well, it's the land of the free, and everybody has an opportunity. And
I mean, the Brits are open about it. The Brits don't pretend that they are some egalitarian society, right? They relish their elitism. Americans, like I said, are just dishonest about their elitism.
Do you think being an outsider has helped you observe more, or do you feel like an outsider after so long?
Well, you have freedom as an outsider to say things because you don't belong to any existing orthodoxy. And I feel like it is always the case that outsiders in any cultural context have a level of freedom that the insider does not. So comics overwhelmingly are drawn from outsider groups. And that's for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons is we're so much more willing to allow someone to poke fun at us if they're not a member of the majority, right? The gay comic can make fun of straight people, and straight people are not going to mind. The black comic can, make ruthless fun of white people, and white people will all laugh, right? There's a kind of, so that if for years and years and years, the huge majority of the comics in North America were Jewish. It's still the case to a large extent. Same thing.
A lot of them Canadian too.
A lot of them Canadian, yeah. It's the same thing. That status gives you a kind of privilege. And because you're not threatening, right? Once you've disarmed your audience by virtue of belonging to an outsider group. And that is, so I sort of feel like I benefited in certain, particularly if you're Canadian, people, they think of you, they don't imagine you as menacing and intimidating if you're Canadian.
Well, you had a perfect upbringing, it seems, for your life and work. You had, this Jamaican mom who was a marriage and family therapist, or have this great mom, and had a wonderful English dad who was a PhD in advanced math. So you had like the empathy and the science, and both those things feeding into the kind of brain and work that you had to do.
Yeah. No, it is. It's funny. I have subsequently discovered a number of people, some of them my good friends, who have a mathematician father and a therapist mom. It seems to be a little bit of a trope, and I wonder whether there's something about those types that seek out. I don't know whether it's the therapist seeking out the mathematician or the mathematician seeking out the therapist.
Probably the mathematician seeking out the therapist.
But a kind of recognition that when you're occupying, one part of the brain, you need someone who occupies the other part of the brain to kind of feel whole. So yeah, it was a very interesting combination of intellectual and emotional influences.
Well, and they found each other in England, at school, and married. It was an interracial marriage, which must have been, still in the UK in the 50s kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And then you moved to Canada and grew up here. And
oh yeah, I had a lovely childhood, and I I always say, growing up in Southern Ontario in the 1970s, I think it just might be, I think you would be hard pressed to find any place and time in history that was more ideal for raising a child than Southern Ontario in the 70s. I mean, you have this, this wonderful, stable, welcoming, safe country, this kind of, I don't know, just like, at a moment when it's kind of blossoming and full of like people from all over. I mean, I grew up in Waterloo County, full of people from all over the world. My father would go off to University of Waterloo, and the number of different nationalities in his department was kind of staggering. I remember my father we had a huge back lawn, several acres of lawn, and so raking the leaves every fall was this incredible, chore. And my father quickly realized that the best way to do it would be to throw a party, which he called the leaf raking party, and invite his graduate students who they were not Canadians. They were invariably from India or Africa. And to them, it was exotic to rake leaves. And it became such a popular thing that by the last year before we moved from this house, and grad students were coming back.
This is like Huckleberry Finn.
It's exactly like Huckleberry Finn. They loved it. They were volunteering. They would call my dad up and said, "When's your leaf raking party?" And I remember our neighbors moved in on the day of the leaf raking party, and there were so many nationalities represented in our little backyard. They thought they'd moved next to a commune. They thought it was like, but that was like, tell me where in the world you can find 15 nationalities happily raking leaves in your backyard, on an October day.
And your dad was responsible for, you say, the science and the rigor, and that your work starts with science, social science quite often.
Yeah. Although my mother is also an exceedingly intellectually organized person. So I would just say very generally, I got from both of them. Both of them have very tidy minds. And I like that kind of tidiness. I like the idea that things, to my mind, things that require explanations should have explanations. And we don't need to be, the explanation does not have to be the final word, but it's just useful to have some kind of working theory as to why something is the way it is. If you think about it in my most recent book, in the COVID chapter, when I'm talking about the pattern of transmission and how a very small number of people are responsible for passing along the virus. It's not all of us, it's a tiny group of us. You need to have, the reason that's so important is, if you're thinking about an epidemic and trying to understand why it behaves the way it behaves, you have to have a theory about transmission. You can't just assume, the virus somehow gets from one person to another. You must have it's like, well,
somehow isn't good enough.
Yeah, somehow it's not good enough. So venture an explanation. What's the model that makes sense of this one? Is it different from the way HIV spread or the way that the flu spreads? And that, having a kind of working model in your mind allows you to kind of, in some ways, tame the epidemic and makes it less scary. Because I think the fundamental problem we had with COVID from the very beginning was that it was terrifying to many people. And that's because they'd never lived in the middle of one before, right? In quite the same way. And I always felt, throughout COVID, I was never scared by it. I was because I knew so much about epidemics. Another very simple rule of thumb, it's not always the case, but the general rule of thumb of epidemics is the more contagious it is, the less lethal it is, right? There's a trade-off. So when I observed in the beginning how insanely contagious COVID was, I was like, it's not going to kill us all. It's going to
killed a lot of people.
Killed a lot of people. But given how many people it infected, it basically infected most of the world, which is an extraordinary act of contagion.
You, obviously your research is formidable, from millions of transcript hours of legal cases and dusty textbooks and shelves of libraries. There's one quote of yours that says, Success is a function of persistence and doggedness and willingness to work hard for 22 minutes to make sense of something most people would have given up on after 30 seconds.
I always, the older I get, the more I come to believe that that kind of persistence and discipline is overwhelmingly the most important element of any kind of success. In fact, I've kind of lost interest in any abstract notion of intelligence if it's divorced from character traits of persistence and discipline. I just don't, it's not useful. You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you're ill-disciplined and lazy, your intelligence is of no use to anyone else. I mean, I don't understand, why are we celebrating it? You're not moving the ball here, right? And you know, I had this 6 or 7 years ago. I started a little audio company with a friend, and so we've been hiring people and working. I've been, for the first time in my life, working in teams, and I've been struck by the same thing. That it's really attitude that I'm interested in.
Effort.
Yeah, some people
Purpose.
and enthusiasm. Some people are enthusiastic and want to work hard, and they're a delight. And some people are not, and they're not a delight. And there's nothing to do with, you know, if all I have to measure is those two variables, enthusiasm and hard work, I'm quite happy.
How did you identify podcasting so early on as something that would be a good place for you to be, that you had a skill set for, that you know, you had a performing element to? You did a lot of speeches, so you knew you have a good voice.
Well, Mike, you know, a very, very good friend of mine, Jacob Weisberg, was already in the business and came to me and said, do you want to do a podcast? So this would have been 11 years ago, at the kind of beginning of the podcast boom. And I said yes almost immediately, because I've been riding the subway of New York, and I had, you know, when I got to New York, I would see people reading, and I would now ride the subway and I would see people listening. I was like, well, that's where people are going, you know. I would be a fool to neglect this.
How do you find your stories?
I mean, all over. It's funny, as I've gotten older, it's gotten easier. I have a backlog now of, and the other interesting thing that's happened with story ideas is and this is a sad fact, that the collapse of the media world has left a million things uncovered. So like, in a world where stuff's being ignored, there's no problem getting story ideas. I mean, everything's just sitting there for the taking. It's incredibly depressing, even as it represents an opportunity.
You've written 8 books now. What ideas are you most proud of from those books?
That's an interesting question. What am I most proud of? I really love, the parts of the books, almost all of my books have had some section where they deal very much with culture or context, place, the kind of external influences. And that, the idea that we are formed as much by things on the outside working on us as opposed to things on the inside of us working on the outside, that idea is the driving idea of almost all of my writing. I've always thought that we get so consumed with who we are and what's on the inside of us that we just greatly overestimate the extent to which we are acutely sensitive to our environment and surroundings. And like I said, in almost every book, I've had a section where I just sort of pivot to that theme and talk about how that theme relates to the particular idea I'm exploring at the moment. But it's odd. It always feels like you're fighting an uphill battle when you try and make that argument to the general public. I think we are, particularly in the West, very, very, very hardwired to think of ourselves as the kind of primary, our internal motivations as being the primary force in deciding who we are.
When your first book, which had its own tipping point, really, insanely successful, was it on the bestseller list for something like 8 years or?
For a long time.
Oh my gosh. But how did you handle that success? What did that do all of a sudden, like speaking here and there, like you were just instant celebrity, Malcolm?
I don't remember it as being, first of all, it's, it's not celebrity as we understand it, right? No writer has, with very, very rare exceptions. So it's a kind of, it is a kind of, you become well known, but you're not a celebrity. So, like a celebrity is someone who, when Taylor Swift walks down the street, traffic stops, right? If you're a well-known writer, it's more like the case that you're sitting in a cafe and someone says, or you're ordering your coffee and the person ahead of you turns and says, "Hey, I like your books," or something. That's what it is. It's very, very, very chill kind of renown, but it didn't change anything. Like it's sort of, I still do exactly the same thing at its core that I did 30 years ago.
One of the things in your life that's never changed, it seems, since high school is running.
Yes.
Yeah, you love running. What is that?
I don't know. I'm injured at the moment. Although I think I'm finally healed. I don't know. It's just one of those things. It's the thing that this is an odd thing to say, but I've always felt it is the thing I do best. It's the thing that comes most natural to me. It's the thing I've always sort of loved it. I've been reasonably successful at it. I don't know. It just is a kind of. My father is someone who required a great deal of physical activity to be happy, and I think I'm the same way. So I think it serves that kind of very, very basic need.
Well, your life has changed pretty dramatically. In your late 50s, you have two little girls now, and
I do.
Moved out of the city, got your minivan,
Yes.
cool hunter that you are.
Yes, I have a minivan, very proud of it.
So your mom must be so happy. Malcolm,
is.
finally you found someone. More grandchildren.
I see you're speaking as someone who has been through this experience. Yes, my mother is very delighted about of getting more grandchildren. I think but I don't think there's no point where you have enough grandchildren, right? It is an insatiable desire, I realize now.
But for you, to be happy for you, to have that in your life, took you a while to get there.
Took me a while to get there, yes, that's correct.
But so is that like you're raising your kids in a small town as you were raised? Do you think, that's a better childhood? Could you be as great a dad as your dad was such a role model for you?
I hope so. And I mean, but so much is you're comparing, upstate New York in the 2020s to Southern Ontario in the 1970s, and the kind of gap between those two experiences seems impossibly vast. And I feel there's a lot more. One of the things I think that was so bucolic about my childhood was it's an era where from a kid's perspective, there is so little to worry about. Whereas, I mean, just the fact that we have phones now means that their adolescence is going to be so dramatically different from mine. Social media, all these sort of...
AI, climate change.
Yeah, like my adolescence was a kind of free ride. I don't expect that of my kids. And also, like, even the college experience, today, when people talk about the college experience, they talk about this sort of ongoing mental health crisis among, which is just such an astonishing contrast to my own college experience, or to the college experience of my peer group. The idea that there was some kind of impending mental health burden to attending college was just unthinkable in 1970s Canada or 1980s Canada. Like, college was escape, it was fun, it was
freedom.
It wasn't, the stakes didn't seem that high, people didn't seem stressed out at all. It was just a blast. And apparently there's a huge section of the current population for whom that is no longer true. I don't know where that comes from, but like, that's very, very different.
The final question we always ask is, what does being Canadian mean to you?
means many things. Canada is all of my family are immigrants to Canada. Many of us are immigrants several times over, but the one thing we all have in common is we all immigrated to Canada. It was the country that welcomed us, and without reservation, that gave us opportunity, that made my mom feel like she was at home, that educated me extraordinarily well for such a small amount of money, which is these days, particularly in the United States, is just an astonishing fact. So I just have, I feel I was privileged to be part of an extraordinary place at a really kind of special moment.
Well, it's been great to spend moments with you and pick your brain. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Tony and Sherry Fell, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, the Linwood Family Foundation, Jim and Sandy Treliving, the Browning Watt Foundation, Richard Pilasoff, Michael McCain and family, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Mary Davey, Clench House Foundation, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, the 63 Foundation, David and Cheryl Carr, the Sheila and David Wilson Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.